I would not recommend you do that with raw manure, because you will not only have your own weed bank, you will have everybody else's weed bank as well with raw manure. So make sure it's either compost or it's at least what we would call conditioned manure. And we have a composting business. Well, it's not. We compost for our own acres. We figured out it's way too much work to try to sell that crap. We're putting it on our own ground, and then we don't have to worry about testing it. But you can take feedlot manure, and probably in 5 or 6 weeks, without fully composting it, turning it a few times, you can get it hot enough to kill the weed seeds. And it's not fully composted. We just call that conditioned. But when we were not doing that, and we've got a 75,000 head feedlot. We don't have it, but it's within 10 miles of our house, so we can literally get all the feedlot manure we want for $1 a ton. We just have to go get it. So we can put all that on that we want, but you just get an incredible amount of weed seeds when you're just spreading raw manure. So we bought a turner. We invested in some equipment and people to be able to condition that. Makes a huge difference. Where we have put that conditioned manure or our compost out, it makes a huge difference. It absolutely does. Is it a substitute for having well-managed grazing? It's better than doing nothing. It's not as good as having the live animals out there, because the biology that's in a cow's rumen is so similar to the biology that's in the soil. You will have some of that in your compost and some of that in the manure, so it's a whole lot better than not doing it. But it's probably not as good as if you're actually managing a well-run herd. Yeah.
So speaking of the biology in the rumen, is that affected by ivermectin and dewormers and all that?
Yeah, so the question is the biology in the rumen affected by dewormers and ivermectin and things like that?
Fly spray.
Yeah, probably some. I don't know that I've never heard that it really affects the gut biology. It definitely affects like dung beetles, things that are going to be feeding on that manure. I think most of that is probably pass-through type stuff. I've never really heard anybody have a lot of concerns of rumen biology.
I think you're mostly speaking of raw, bulk manure, but what about liquid manure, hog manure? It's not rumen.
Yeah, if you have liquid manure, I mean, because that's not going to have weed seeds in it, right?
Shouldn't.
Yeah. My main concern with raw manure would be weed seeds, and not the fact that I wanted to, compost out some of the water or stuff like that. It's weeds.
Back to your nitrogen thing, we don't know if the weed seeds come with the manure or you're feeding what's there with the nitrogen and you get a weed bank.
I've seen how these feedlots work. It's coming, isn't it?
We're talking about liquid.
Yeah.
Manure.
I wouldn't think that the liquid manure would have many weed seeds. It may be triggering a germination of the weeds that you have.
Water and nitrogen.
But I don't think you're importing other people's weed seed problems. Is he okay back there? Got a little too warm there or something. So anyway, well-managed compost, and here's the other thing. When you're doing feedlot manure, you probably need to be putting on 10, 12, 15 tons an acre. When we make our own compost and we put that on, we're putting on 1 to 2 tons an acre is all, and feel like that's sufficient. And we started making compost mostly because we had a lot of waste product from our seed cleaning operation and just needed a way to get rid of that. Plus we had access to all this manure. And when people figure out that you're composting stuff, they'll bring you all kinds of junk, or what they consider to be junk. So last year, when the word got out that we were composting, we had a couple co-ops start calling us and say, hey, can we bring you some of our rotten corn, from the corn piles that, and then that they blend off everything they can, and this is just the stuff that's so bad they couldn't even blend it off. We said, sure, bring it on out. So by the time they and the neighboring co-op got done hauling, we probably had 250,000 bushels of black corn. And it was a giant pile of black corn. We were afraid it was going to catch on fire because it was dry at that time, because some of it was 3 or 4 years old. But if it got wet, that stuff would get super hot. So we put it out in windrows and we turned it, and we didn't really compost it all the way out, there was so much of it, but we got it to where it broke down pretty well, and then we just about all of our land got some of that corn compost, and it was really high in phosphorus, really high in a lot of the trace minerals. So we get dead pigs. There's a pig farm not far away. We take them straw or wood chips or corn stalk bales. We provide them with a lactobacillus inoculant. Charge them a couple $1,000 a month to do that. They layer it in pits. They throw all their dead pigs in and soak it down with that lactobacillus, and then we'll pull that compost. And generally within a few months, the only thing left is ear tags. There's no bones left, and that's just the power of that biology. But without the lactobacillus, without that bacteria actively working on that, it'd be a big bone pile.
So Keith, now you're making me nervous. But that takes a lot to get me worried about the future. 15 years from now, go back to that 15 years from now, do you expect that most growers will be doing some sort of composting?
No, it's too much work.
Okay, so you're doing it. You're not doing it for fun. You're doing it because it works for you, right? Or
We're doing it because we have access to a lot of the. It takes so much raw material to do it. If you don't have easy access to that, you can never afford the freight to haul all that. That feedlot's 10 miles away. The pig farm is 8 miles away. We're generating our own seed cleanings. We can buy corn stalk bales pretty cheap from neighbors who don't know the value of them. We don't bale our own corn stalks. We buy the neighbors' corn stalks and compost those.
because we've got a guy here you're going to meet later, Michael Lubers, and he's compost, driving us crazy because, and we're going to give him a little corner of the field, but what you're saying is to really do things right here. If we can, we should.
Yeah.
I said he drives us crazy, but we still keep him around.
So I mean, if you can compost, you probably should. Now, so what everybody could be looking at is like the Johnson-Su method of making a high-grade aerobic static compost, and you could just make it in a 4x4 shuttle, and that will be enough compost not to spread across 16 acres, but then you pull an extract out of that. You're extracting the biology, you're extracting the biostimulants that the biology has created, and then you're using that as a seed treatment, you're using that as a foliar application. So my guess is there will be a lot of people using compost type products. I don't know how many of them will be making it themselves.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
So I still haven't answered
Yeah.
your question fully.
The original question.
The original question was kind of on these 60, and so I kind of talked a little bit about the 101. That would be a little bit of what we would see. In our area in Nebraska, we have a lot of seed corn fields, so we see a lot of interseeding into that. It's getting to be more and more popular into conventional field corn fields. What we've learned is several things. Number one, you got to get it in on time. If you wait till V5 or V6, you have missed the boat and it's not going to work. You got to be going at V3. Some guys are even pushing V2. Don't do it at the same time you plant your corn. You'll hurt yourself. But if you wait till V6 to get started, it'll be V10 by the time you get done, and you will not get enough establishment before that corn canopies, and you're just not going to have much growth there.
If it's a narrow row.
If it's a narrow row, yes. People in Nebraska don't know anything except 30. Well, maybe 36, but yeah. So this changes things. I'm talking about the 30s. We did have a guy this year used a fairly high amount of yellow blossom sweet clover. That looks really good. We're gonna be looking at yellow, and of course this year you can't hardly find any clovers because of production issues. So, but the yellow blossom sweet clover looked really good. As we move to wider rows, and we have more sunlight now hitting these plants, now we have more options. And now it becomes even more important for us to ask you the question, what do you want to try to accomplish? What are your goals? For some people, the goal, well, I want to try to grow as much nitrogen here to feed this through the season. Okay, well, then we're going to go almost all legumes here, and we're just going to try to max out nitrogen production, and if we have sufficient mycorrhizal activity, because this corn plant, the roots are not ever going to physically intersect with that bean plant or that cowpea plant. The roots physically don't intermesh. They can touch, but there's no transfer just root to root. Again, it has to come through the biology, and when you have the mycorrhiza fungi, the hyphae will grow from one plant root into another plant root of a completely different species, and then you will see nitrogen exchange from a legume to a grass. You can even see this corn shuttling some phosphorus back over to the legumes. You'll see a lot more sharing when you have that mycorrhiza. Again, in the absence of biology, doesn't matter what you have out here, they're not going to communicate, they're not going to be able to share those nutrients and resources, and it will come. It will come. Now, we didn't inoculate this with mycorrhiza fungi. We could have. I mean, it's another $12 an acre to do that. We really recommend you do that if you're planting perennials, where you're not going to have another chance to plant that, and there's going to be no break in the growing. With annual crops, as even the traditionally, conventionally farmed systems, there's going to be mycorrhiza out there. It's just going to be low populations, and it will take a while to build up those populations, but they will come. And I know, Terry, I don't know if you want to speak to this or not, where you guys are at with trying to do some mycorrhiza testing. Is that something Ward Labs is still pushing forward on?
Yes, it is. It's still in the development stage. We're having to modify how we've been running our PLFA test slightly in order to get that data, but and I won't get into it very deep at all yet, but that's something to look for coming down the line here in the next, hopefully, 3 to 4 months.
So suffice it to say, to really truly know and understand how much colonization of your crop you have with mycorrhiza fungi, you can't just pull a soil sample and send it to the lab. It doesn't work that way. You have to actually send them roots, and they have to stain them and then look at them under a microscope and actually count. It's really hard to do with the current testing technology. So Ward Labs is doing some good work in trying to figure out how to make that a little easier. So anyway, we could just really load up on legumes if our main goal was to feed these plants. If our main goal, we really want to build soil, because you would think if I can grow all the nitrogen I possibly can, that's really going to build my soil. Well, nitrogen is a good thing, but anything that gets out of balance, it can start to be a bad thing. And so if we get this out of balance and we have all legumes and we have almost no carbon in this, the carbon nitrogen ratio is very low, this is going to be a bare strip. And anytime the soil gets bare, bad things happen. It can wash away, it can blow away, it's going to get too hot. Your biology, is going to leave because, or at least going to go dormant or go deeper. So we don't want to leave the soil bare, so we can't go too far to any one extreme, with the legumes. So we always want to have some carbon in it. Again, if you told me, well, I want to grow corn, I want to grow as much corn as I can, but, I've got livestock, and so I'm going to come through here and graze all this after harvest. So it would be really good for me to have as much biomass grown here, for, high quality forage biomass as possible, so that I can take some income off of that from grazing after the harvest year. That's going to change what we would recommend here. And I kind of designed this one somewhat in the middle. As you look at this, it looks like there's a lot of millet in here. Okay, but if you look at that sheet, there's only 2 pounds of millet in this whole mix. But it would look like, half the mix is millet. So the millet really did well. It's going to be a high quality grazing plant. So when we designed this, kind of this max soil builder, I think we called it, I just really went with what I felt like was a fairly well balanced mix that would accrue benefits both from some nitrogen fixation, but also from accumulating a lot of carbon and a lot of biomass. Now, looking at this, and probably in retrospect, I probably should have skewed more towards the legume side, knowing that this was going to be shut off cold turkey from nitrogen. This system is nitrogen deficient. It's biologically, it's deficient in a lot of things, and that's what happens when you go cold turkey. I mean, there's just no way around that. So I think we'll see some significant changes, and it will be really interesting to see how these strips will do that. But I would probably skew more towards the legumes in the future, especially if we want to, try to get this corn crop to be more profitable. And again, the other option would have been, and this, Bob, next time you do this, maybe you take half the field and you don't even plant corn the first year. You just go with a big diverse cover crop, and that's it for year one. Graze it, and then come back in. And it would be really interesting to see the difference between the side that had a year off, essentially a soil building year, and then the same strips planted into it, just to see how much a jump start we could get in doing that.
That's a really interesting comment. Do you have an opinion on whether the issue here is water or nitrogen? You haven't said much about water and rainfall, and that's the world Graham and I have been living in. Is
Yeah.
we had so little. There's a graphic over here, but it's almost nothing. We've been comforted by we didn't get rain.
Yeah.
But what you're telling me is even with rain, our cold turkey on the synthetic nitrogen may have been a big contributor to what we have here.
Well, the comparison is, what do neighboring fields look like that had nitrogen? Probably going to be a lot better than this.
Yeah.
And they probably got the same water.
Yeah.
So that would be your comparison there. So certainly water is a huge mitigating factor in this. But even with the water, I think you probably still, now it would have been, everything I think would have been harvestable,
Yep.
but it would have still been pretty low because of just that nitrogen, lack of nitrogen.
Keith, you spoke in the, nitrogen building and putting legumes in there, and if you're seeding with something like that in these wider rows and trying to do the nitrogen builder to support the corn in there, what kind of a mix might you have in order to not have, get the ground covered? So if you don't have the ground covered, you're gonna have weeds.
Yeah. Well, I would look at more cowpeas. I think we had some, now knowing that this is not going to rotate to soybeans, that's really good information because now we can use soybeans as a cover crop. If we were doing a corn soybean rotation, I would not touch soybeans at all as a cover crop because you want to break those disease and pest cycles. But if you're not growing soybeans as your rotation crop, they make a wonderful cover crop. And so I would increase my cowpeas, my soybeans. I don't know that I would do sun hemp. Sun hemp's a great warm season legume. It can produce a lot of nitrogen. It would wrap up on your snapper rollers if you didn't figure out a way to knock those down. So I think I would stay away from sun hemp because it'll get 6, 7, 8 feet tall and can get pretty ropey. I would see that turning into an issue, a harvest issue. I would probably look more at some of the Mediterranean type clovers like a berseem or a Persian clover that will do better in the heat than like a red or a crimson would. From what I saw on yellow blossom sweet clover and some of those things, I'd put some of that in because yellow blossom will overwinter for you and you'll have that growing out here next year. Now, if you're committed to doing no herbicides, now that becomes an issue of how do you terminate that yellow blossom, because you're probably not going to kill that by rolling it. And so that, sometimes overwintering is a good thing, but it can become, at some point you've got to get it knocked out as well. So there's a lot of things that go into what we would put in your mix, and part of it is how are you going to terminate it if we do get it to overwinter. Red clover is the same way. You're not going to kill red clover by crimping it. You got to have, or alfalfa, alfalfa. So, and I know people are starting to experiment with having perennial cover crops. Using alfalfa and just trying to get it beat back and then getting your corn up ahead of it. And, Rick Clark and Dan DeSutter, those guys are doing a lot of it. And some years it works pretty good for them, and other years, man, they really struggle. And it's largely weather dependent.
Well, one of the things that Lauren has done is strip spray. So if we came in, and why I like the wide rows, commercial announcement here, but is you got a little bit of room to play with the corn and still undisturb what's in the middle. Is that a reasonable termination strategy, or does it have to be terminated throughout the whole strip?
Well, I don't know that it has to be terminated. The number one rule, the cardinal rule of interseeding anything is to do no harm to your cash crop. I mean, that should be your rule. Now, if you knew what the weather was going to be, we could really make that rule work almost every year. you know, based on timing and seeding rates and what we did and what we put on. Not knowing that, you have to kind of make some assumptions, you got to make some guesses, and again, that's why I wouldn't go out and plant this the same time you planted your corn. You know, you want to delay, you know, to V2, V3, V4, somewhere in there. You got to be a little careful about seeding rate on more aggressive species, you know, because you don't want them to just take over. And you see that, you know, in the 90-inch stuff, as you get your way down here, the cover crop is, you know, 2 or 3 times as much as this, but it has suppressed the corn. There's no doubt about it. You know, some of it's going to be a little bit of a sunlight effect. Some of it's going to be a moisture effect. You know, they're all competing for limited resources, nutrients, water, and sunlight. And so you definitely see that effect in those wider rows where there's just more sunlight coming in. But the other thing that you see, and maybe we should just move down here and look at this because it's really impressive.